Welcome back to the final part of this tutorial. In this section, I'm going to be taking you through detailing the elemental and adding any final touches to the painting. So let's get started. For doing the elemental itself, it kind of presented a challenge of how to bring this in line with the rest of the painting. So I decided on doing higher detail painting combined with real textures. And that's something that you may come across every now and again, is how to approach a problem and how to best solve it. And so you see me, I've taken my chalky brush, and I'm just sampling off what I've had with Alt. My brush size is very small. You can quickly change brush size using the bracket tools, the left and right brackets. So I'm just coming in, I'm sampling off and trying to add finer detail to the rock faces. And originally I had mentioned that the growth on the elemental did give me some problems here, and you see me going over it and deleting it. And that's something else to think about when you are matte painting, is if this is going to be incorporated into the final image, you may want to break it up in a way that allows you to easily edit it later. And now I've taken this spongy brush, usually used for trees. Something about brushes is that they have many different uses. Just because a brush looks like say, a tree or a leaf or something doesn't mean that you can't use it for other purposes, because by adjusting the brush settings and manipulating it, you can create different effects. And for that brush, I did the same thing where I turned on color dynamics to create jitter in how it looks. Coming down to the middle section now, adding in some darker strokes along the side there. And just by doing that, you can create different faces in rocks. It's really created by dark and light. So, when you have those dark areas, this usually represents, say, a face that's coming in towards away from the light, or a deeper crack in the rock itself. And here I'm taking a tree branch and adding in a little tree just to add an interesting detail to the elemental, just something different that kind of stands out and adds some visual interest to it. And now I've gone back to my scatter brush and I'm painting in more of the foliage, because I did find that that worked out really well for creating the heavier growth, whereas the other brush was great for creating that sparse look. And I did want this mossy texture to kind of spread out and disperse as it got further away from the source. Just sampling off, and I'm adding a layer behind and painting in some more of those vines coming back. And I wanted to be careful when I was adding these to not make it end up looking like hair on the elemental. That was something I noticed at first when I first started adding in the painting, or the paint, is that it did look like the elemental was growing a luscious head of hair on there. Coming in and I'm lining the inside out, just trying to define where the faces end to the chest piece there. And you notice a lot of times when you look at objects, they don't have a straight, solid edge to them. They don't just suddenly turn away and create a very sharp edge. And that's something you can think about when you create rocks and similar surfaces, is that there will be a small gradual shift in how it changes. So you saw at the top of that little section there, I added little highlights to adjust and show that the rock face is turning up to go to the outside of it. And I'm adding in some bushes, and they didn't look very good to what I was doing here, and I got rid of them. And that's something that you need to decide on when you are using photo elements in a painting like this, is do they fit with what you need? Some photos are really great, they're really sharp and have a lot of detail to them, but they just might not fit with what you want. Coming in, adding a tree, and you saw me do the same blending trick. And I do this because it gives you a lot of control over the lighting on an object, and it allows you to quickly change how it looks later on if you need to. So if the lighting isn't quite right, you can just adjust that second layer to fix the lighting. You want to be careful because say you've gotten a photo in and you've done a lot of work to it, but then you realize that you need to change something major to it. You're going to have to go back out, get the photo again, bring it in, do all that work again, and you've just wasted a lot of time. Whereas using the duplication, you can just quickly edit. Now I'm filling in the grass, or the foliage on the back. They're using that same chalky brush with spacing turned up, scattering, angle jitter, color dynamics. And here I'm bringing in a real texture and setting it to overlay, I believe. And something to think about when you do bring in real textures is that they may not conform to what you need. So a way to fix that is to bring up the transform, right click on it, or go to edit and change the transform settings and bring it to warp. And then you saw me just kind of bring in that curve, or the transform, and curve it to the elemental's head, just to change how the texture sits. And something else you want to watch out for when bringing in real textures is that if they spread out over different areas, you want to make sure you break them up, so it doesn't just look like the texture is continuing into this different section that wouldn't make sense. With rock textures, you can kind of get away with it because it is not very uniform and it's hard to detect where things really separate. Coming back in, adding some more detail to the foliage on the back, adding in some larger bushes, because I didn't want it to just look like, say, this little mossy texture. I wanted it to have variation to it. There is, say maybe a bigger bush over here, and there's some little vines hanging down there. And then for the other trees, I decided to paint them in, and you can get away with this sometimes if there's a lot of information in a particular section, because by adding all these little vines and little details in, it kind of becomes jumbled together. So I didn't necessarily have to go and find a bunch of photos to create a lot of variation in that section, whereas where I just paint, I can just create as much variation as I need to. But for the four trees, I wanted to use a mixture of real photos and painting. And I wanted to show that the foliage is ramping around the back, so the entire back of this elemental is just covered in this growth. That's something else that to keep in mind is as things recede from the eye, and you might not necessarily be able to see everything on that far side, but you also need to think about what's coming up from that side. A trick you can use with photos and a mixture painting is painting on top of the photos just a little bit to bring the detail in line down with the other painted sections. And this helps trick the eye to believing that it's all real, especially when you look at it as a whole. And I'm just going in, adding some more detail, trying to add some of those highlights from the real photos I used on those branches, because there is a lot of variation in foliage. You know, if you go outside and look at a tree, those leaves are not going to be all a single shade of green. And I'm adding in some darker shadows to the section there because I want to show that there's space underneath here, but the rocks are still close enough together that they're not going to be picking up a lot of ambient light. Again, I'm trying to paint over some of the growth that I had done originally and add some deeper shadows in there because that section was really flat. It was mostly just a gradient of light to dark. There is going to be a lot of different faces to this. I want it to have this worn look to it. This elemental would be very old. It would have a lot of wear and tear on it. And another good way to show it is just make little cracks in the surface of the rock texture. So taking a very tiny brush, just a few pixels, just making little strokes in it. And it might look weird at first when you first put them on, but after adding a few of them, it can, and you pull back from being zoomed in, it does look like they belong there. And when I am doing higher detail rock painting, I usually set the brush to have a slight angle jitter to it, because rock is very rarely smooth, except, you know, maybe when you're up close to it and you're looking at a nice flat section, it might appear to be pretty smooth, or of course any polished rocks or anything. But just natural rock is usually going to be very bumpy, and just by having a little variation in the brush, it helps create a different texture to your strokes. I'm adding in a vine coming up from the center there. I just thought it would add some interesting variation in the growth. So it'd be a mixture of, say, these little plant sections and then some of these really bigger vines and things just growing over the elemental. And I'm trying to spread out and adding in some more of those little cracks. And then I'm going to the floating rocks here, and I'm adding some lighter spots here because they would be picking up light from the sky and from behind. You know, they are pretty out in the open. They're not just going to be these really dark objects, at least the higher up ones. The ones down towards the valley, those are going to be a little darker because there isn't going to be much light falling in there, and there isn't going to be quite as much light bouncing upwards. Coming in, adding some more small details to faces here, little highlights to different areas. So say you can add little light hits to show that there might be a little bit of light streaming in through the shadows here and hitting that little point on the rock to show that these rocks aren't just sitting in a line, they're floating in space. They're, you know, different z-space and relation to each other. So they might cast shadows on each other and allow a little bit of light to stream in. Coming in, just, you see again and again I'm adding little strokes and the direction I want them to appear. Bringing in a second texture here. Because there's a lot of variation in the rocks there, the different floating rocks, you see me go in with a layer mask and hide a lot of what was there. And that's what I was talking about before, where the texture would just kind of spread into the other sections. And it would look kind of funny to have a certain part of the texture be on another floating piece that obviously wouldn't be connected. Adding some more of the growth. And I wanted it to taper off as it reached that middle section, because I was thinking that the elemental would move kind of similarly to, if you've ever played World of Warcraft or seen any pictures, how the bottom half is just these kind of rocks floating around and they move. So the growth wouldn't really be able to get attached there. And just adding in some maybe minor growth to one of the bigger sections that wouldn't be moving quite as much. Adding in some faces to kind of help create a separation of the side and the front there. And you can see just by adding a few simple shadows, you can really create faces in different directions. Moving on to the hand there. And I did lose a little bit of recording time here. Something did go wrong with one of the recordings, and it didn't record after a couple minutes, so I did lose about 15 or 20 minutes. But nothing that I haven't been doing for this little section, just painting in smaller details, going over the bigger, messier strokes to bring them in line with the rest of the painting with higher detail. And really a lot of what higher detail painting is just going over the messier strokes and polishing them. Bringing in another texture for the bottom half. I believe what was missed was just finishing detailing those bottom rocks. And then I change it to overlay, and I'm using warp again. And I'm leaving it at 100% at the moment just to see what the texture looks like. And then bringing it down to a little under half, going in with the mask and gently going over with a soft brush to break up the texture. You know, some areas of the texture might show up better than others. Another texture for the arm. And again to overlay. Bring it down to about half. And now I'm doing the blending trick for the main elemental itself, where you right click, go into blending options, go to color overlay, and set the color to sample out the sky, and then depending on how far it is in relation to the camera, you either darken it or leave it fairly light. Duplicate that layer, mask the duplication, set it to screen, and then paint in your highlights. And you just see me going with a semi-soft brush. And I don't want to go in with too soft of a brush because I don't want the edges to kind of look like they have a bloom to them. I do want the shadows to transition fairly fast because this isn't too far away and it's not really a large object, whereas say a cloud would taper off very slowly or a mountain. But on smaller objects the shadow is going to jump pretty quickly from light to dark. If you ever notice, like in your house and you're looking at a light coming in through a window and it just has this really bright area and then all of a sudden it shifts, there really isn't much of a slow taper off in the shadow. Going back in, and I had found that the brush I'd used was a little too soft, so I'm trying to go back over some of what I did there to sharpen the edges up. Adding the same color overlay to the arm, and I did break the elemental into several pieces, the main body itself and then the arm, because the arm would be kind of a pain to paint around. And then the growth for the upper section, growth for the lower section, and then the core itself, and adding in that extra curves adjustment so I can really adjust how the lighting shifts along the elemental. I want the dark to be obviously darker because it's in that valley, and kind of darken in some of those crevices to add more depth to them. And I'm masking out some of the core going through the different faces there, and I found this kind of sparkly brush, and I set it to linear dodge, and I sampled off the other color I did there. And I'm just adding in little lines to the darker areas to show that this is where, say, the energy would be pouring out of the different pieces. These little crevices and indentations in the rock is where the energy that binds it is kind of exposed. And it really helps draw everything together. It helps the viewer know that even if they don't really understand that this elemental has a core or anything, they can see that this energy seems to be all over it and is what's kind of bringing it to life. Just adding small little hits and going back over the core, adding some finer details to it with that same brush, because it was just a little too blurred out. And just adding some darker spaces in there. Next, I'm coming in, and something I mentioned, I believe either in the first or I believe in the second tutorial, was that the foreground section looked like it was just blending in with the middle section there. And so I'm coming in with some mist to add some visual interest to the landscape. This would be a valley, so there would be a lot of moisture trapped in here. And I'm just adding some slight mist and smaller clouds. You can see me adding in mist between the section there, and just by doing that, it certainly creates this very obvious separation between those two land masses. And so if you can't necessarily create lighting that would separate them, you can add little other variations in it to kind of do what you want. That just about wraps this up for this particular painting. I did go in with another levels adjustment and very gently brightening up the center of the painting. And another slight thing I did was bloom coming in over the light source. So that wraps this up, and I hope this was helpful for you, at least to kind of understand the overall process of how this is done. And I do realize that this doesn't really show a good step-by-step of how to go about doing something like this. And in the future I will be doing kind of much slower paintings where I take it step by step to really help bring you through what I want to do. So thank you for watching, and stay tuned.